I'm a big believer in second chances, even for people who commit serious crimes. Who deserves a second chance? Who gets one? And who decides? I'm Jessica Henry, and I'll be your host of Just Justice. I'm a former public defender, a professor of justice studies, and an award-winning author. And I'm excited for us to find new ways to put justice back into our criminal legal system. Hello and welcome to Just Justice. My name is Jessica Henry and I'll be your host. Today we have the pleasure of talking with someone who is not only an amazing author, but is also a very dear friend of mine, Nikki Mammano. Nikki's memoir, Breaking Good, traces her journey from suburban New Jersey to the drug underworld of Waikiki through addiction, arrest, prison, and ultimately recovery. It's dark in places, it's funny in other places, and it's really honest about trauma and the choices that come from trauma. And it's not just a story about personal downfall and redemption, but it's also a story about the criminal justice system, about who gets punished, how addiction is treated, what's prison like, and really what it takes to rebuild a life once you've been labeled by the system. And I am so excited to dive in with you today, Nikki. I'm so glad that you are here.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here. Thank you for having me here. And I'm really excited to talk about all things Breaking Good.
It's such a good book, everyone. Before we even get started, I should say I personally don't read a lot of memoir. But this book I could not put down. Breaking Good is such a well-written story. And even though, Nikki, I know it is about your life, it also just reads like a Hollywood novel, like a film or something. It's just amazing. And it's amazing that you lived through it. And I'm so glad that you're here to talk with us about it. So let's just jump in for a minute. You grew up in suburban New Jersey. And I'm wondering if we can go back to that moment and what did your life look like from the outside looking in? If someone were to see you in suburban New Jersey, what do you think they would have thought? And how did that match with your reality?
Yeah, I grew up in the suburbs of New Jersey, and it looked like a very normal middle class life. I went to school, and no one would know any better that there was a lot of abuse and trauma going on behind that. I had my hair done, and I was dressed like every other kid, and I showed up, and I had family at home, and I lived in a house, and there were other things going on that I address in the book, a lot of dark things that were happening behind the scenes. And, it's not till part two that I go into that, but I try to take everyone back to kind of see what does go on behind the scenes. And especially in the 70s, 80s, when people weren't looking, they weren't pulling back the curtain to see what was happening
Mhm.
inside the home. And so, as my therapist has said before, like I was throwing up flares and I was, but being that people weren't looking for it and it was well hidden by how I looked on the outside, no one really saw what was happening inside.
I love that image of you as a young person throwing up flares saying, I'm in a lot of trouble here, and nobody really recognizing it and seeing that. And that's sort of so painful when you look back to realize there were so many moments when people could have intervened and they didn't. And one of the things I do want to caution listeners as we're having this conversation, both Nikki and I don't want to give away too much about this book. So we're struggling with what details to include and what not. So if we're being a little too cryptic, I apologize. I don't think we are, but we'll see how this all goes. So without giving too much away, you get yourself in quite a pickle in New Jersey. You start experimenting with drugs, and you eventually leave for Hawaii, for Waikiki. Did that feel like freedom? Was that an escape? Like, what happened that led you to go to Hawaii? As far away in the United States as you can get from New Jersey.
Yeah, and there's a few things happened in between there. I did grow up in the suburbs. I ended up moving to Rockland County, New York, where I was in high school. I got into a lot of partying, and I ended up in rehab first before I ever went out to Hawaii. So I had cleaned up and thought that I had this new lease on life. And then one day while I was in Florida, at a halfway house, a friend that I partied with pretty hard in high school called me and said I had a dream, and she was going to the University of Hawaii. She's like, "You got to come out here. I had totally had a dream. You were in my dream, and you're coming." And I was like, Okay, like this sounds amazing. I'm gonna leave Florida, head back home, figure my stuff out, and head out to Hawaii. So that's all to say there was a little bit of a windy road to get there, but it felt like was fresh out of rehab. I was ready for my new life. I was ready to do college. I was ready to start a business with my friend. We were going to do health food and natural stuff. I was, completely in that mode of thinking and living. And little did I know that that was not, that was total opposite of what actually was going to happen.
So you get to Hawaii and it slowly or quickly becomes apparent that you are not going to be this blonde-haired, blue-eyed, bright-eyed college student who stays on the straight and narrow. Your addiction returns pretty quickly. And I'm wondering what happened to you internally? What was going on internally for you as you fell back into drug use?
Well, I think, this is a common theme. I mean, people that use drugs and end up where I end up in prison, end up on the streets, are people that, mostly have trauma or something going on in their life where they felt less than. There's a lot of reasons, but it all goes back to not healing, not doing the work and understanding what drove us to that in the first place. And so I had gone to rehab. I was so young. I wasn't ready to take it in. I was staying clean. I wasn't really doing the work and understanding what actual healing was like. And so I went out there with these grand plans, thinking that it was going to just be amazing. And here I was, I had gone to rehab. I'm ready to live life. And, without the healing, the pain, the escape is always going to be there. And part two, which is about the trauma, it starts with I've always been a runner. And I end up at the end with, I eventually had to stop running and stand in my pain. And until we do that, we tend to have a harder time staying sober and building a life. And so my pain was just always there. And so I got to Hawaii and I had all these plans and they fell apart very quickly.
Yeah, and I mean it's interesting too because in the book, you talk about how you sort of arrived with this grand vision and how just readily available drugs were to you and how that just felt comfortable and and sort of a space that was familiar to you and wound up being what you embraced while you were there. And in Waikiki, you became someone who, and I'm quoting from you, always could get what you need. What did that identity give you? Was there glamour? Was it scary? Like, what did it mean to be able to procure drugs and eventually sell drugs, sort of at the level that you were able to?
So originally, I went out to Hawaii and I quickly became an addict, like I had just said. And often people that are addicts tend to deal small time just to pay for what they have. And I was partying a lot and I was a college student. And so I did that. And that I was doing that with the friend that I came out there with. But, we were partying very hard and it quickly, because of the drugs, our relationship fell apart. And I ended up moving in with our dealer. And from there, he just had me running through the clubs and running some stuff for him. And it was kind of fun. Like I was this new it girl and I was in the clubs and people are partying and it's the lights and people are dancing and everyone's like, wants to talk to me and I'm dealing and it's a fun night. And I was actually having a great time. But soon after that, his dealer caught, she got a glimpse of me and started to figure out that I was the one moving his product. And pulled me in. And so that became a little different. That became a different level of dealing where I was starting to get a little over my head. It was a place that I didn't expect to get to. I don't, and I've said this before, but I don't think most people grow up and think, I'm going to be a drug dealer. That's what I want to do. Like, that's not most
Not
little
only am I
girls'
going to be a
dreams.
drug, right? Like, not only am I going to be a drug dealer, but I'm going to be a heck of a drug dealer. I'm going to be
Right.
a tough drug dealer, right? But that is what happened pretty quickly going in because someone did sort of identify you as a very successful, smart, savvy drug dealer.
Yeah. And I went to her house and she gave me some product and was like, hey, listen, don't get from him here. And I went out and thought, okay, I'll see what I can do. And it was just immediate. I had sold it. People started to we had beepers back then. I had this like little teal
Remember those? Oh my
beeper.
goodness.
And it's like a little bit see-through, a little color. Um, and so my beeper started going off and we're running from payphone to payphone. I mean, this is the 90s. And I flipped it so fast. And I went back and I flipped it again. And she was like, wait, I'm giving you more. And then I flipped it again. And soon someone introduced me to the person who was actually dealing for all the clubs. And there I was, suddenly it like fell in it was almost like things were just falling in my lap. It was like the roads were opening up for me. And I was just,
In the world of drug dealing.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly, exactly. And so there were certain points for sure that I was like, what am I doing? I'm way over my head. Guns started coming out. There was danger. We had bodyguards. People were getting ripped off and kidnapped. And I at that point I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to back out. I didn't know how to change it. And I was also using.
Yeah, yeah. That is so interesting, right? You went from being sort of a dealer at the street level to much higher level dealer with sort of more institutional clients, but you were way in over your head and you were still an addict who wasn't necessarily in control. And I'm wondering, when did you realize sort of you weren't in control anymore?
I think, at first I got the clubs in Waikiki and it was fun. I talk about the person that was running, the main runner of the clubs, and she was like a mother to me, and I loved her. And I was surrounded by trans women and drag queens and club kids, and it was a blast. It was a party. And then suddenly I started to realize that the guns were coming out and that there was protection and that there was dangerous things happening. And then suddenly I was introduced, and like I say, I didn't look for this, but suddenly someone comes to me and they are dealing to the local prison, and now they want to pick up from me. And then suddenly I run into someone who is dealing to the army and the navy, and before I know it, I'm way over my head. And I know that things are getting scary and could get dark. But then that was just what I was doing. It's like I didn't know how to back out. I didn't know what to do. I think one of the times that I was the most scared, and I talk about this in the book, was the time that I was basically kidnapped. I walked into, so there was a lot of people that would try to get to bigger dealers and break in and rip them off. And so I was a big dealer, but I was still mobile. Whereas the person above me wasn't mobile. She basically stayed home and people only came to her. I did both. And so they knew that they could find me on the street. And so they did. And I went in, they knew where I was going next because someone gave me away. And I came in and there was someone sitting there with a machete, and they took me and, tried to get into my dealer. And I knew that they could kill me. And,
Mm,
I at that point, I was like, oh boy.
yeah. You know, that sounds so scary. And for listeners, Nikki is tiny. She's like 5 foot nothing. What are you, 5'1", 5'2", 5'3"?
Barely. I raised 5 feet. Are you kidding?
Yeah, she's
Like
like
just
little
under.
and she's
Yeah.
tiny. So, you have to kind of imagine what that must have been like when she was really young and tiny and dealing all these drugs in these prison settings. I mean, not prison settings, in these club settings, and I guess to prisoners and to the army bases. But you said something also that I thought was so interesting that I just want to pause on. You said that the woman who was helping you deal drugs at the club was like a mother to you. And that's such a contrast in ideas, right? To think of a drug dealer, particularly the head of a drug ring, as a mother figure. Can you say a little bit more about that and maybe the relationships that you wound up forming, even though you were in this context of drug dealing, illegal, selling illegal drugs?
Yeah. I was always looking for a home. And that's kind of the adventure that I was on. I had felt like I always was looking for love and care and community and to be accepted and seen. And so in my life of dealing drugs, I run into this wonderful kind. And back in the day, and I address this in the book because it's how the times, it's the words that we used back then and the terms. Most people said drag queen, trans woman wasn't really uh, used at that time. And so these days, a lot of those women that I was with would call themselves trans women. I use drag queen in the book because that's what they called themselves. Um, but this one woman, she was the head runner for the clubs. She's the one that got directly from me and then sent out all these club kids into the clubs, and they would come at, and then she'd meet with me. And she was just warm and loving and kind. And I would go to her for advice. And I don't know, we just had a special relationship. She's the one that eventually sent me away when it was time for me to go, and get out of there, when it was not good for me to be on that island anymore. And I was so sad. I didn't want to leave her. I didn't want to leave Hawaii, even though I knew that it was not the place for me. And I knew what I had been through. She's the one that said, you've got to get out of here. This place isn't for you. Go home, have a life. And so this wonderful, warm woman that I met in the most insane circumstances did what no one had done for me before, which was to send me away, to save me, to do what what hurt her, what she didn't want to do, to make sure that I was okay. And that was a big deal for me, and I will always be grateful to her and always miss her.
I think what struck me about what you just said and also about some of the relationships you formed in the book is that, it sort of goes to this larger idea that people are complex, right? And they can both be doing something illegal that causes great harm to the community and also be incredible humans, and hold both spaces at the same exact time. It's really an interesting dichotomy that we exist in. It's like life is so not binary as much as we might think it is. But there you are. So you're sort of the it girl. You're doing this thing. You're making a lot of money. You're making a lot of people nervous. You're making a lot of people jealous. And then you get arrested. It's game over. What did that moment feel like when you were arrested?
I had been on the run, and one of the things that I say, one of my taglines in the book is how many PTA moms have been on the run from the feds, because I was literally, eventually later on, as everyone knows me now, I live in suburbia and I have my children and do my thing. But at one point, I was on the run from the feds, and it was scary. And the woman that I was just talking about, she's the one that hid me. She's the one that took care of me. She's the one that fed me and talked to me when I was scared. And I knew I was going down because there were people in our world that had feelers out into both worlds. They lived in both worlds. They lived in the legal world. They knew what was going on with the cops, and they also lived in our world. And so I had already gotten word that the feds had landed and they were looking for me. So I was scared and at my wit's end, and I didn't know how to. I'm on an island. There's not many places to run. And so I had an opportunity to possibly get off the island. And I cover this in the book. I talk about this. I knew deep down inside that I was walking into my arrest, but I wanted to believe that I was going to maybe get out and get home and get away. And so I went to this meeting place, with this tiny little bit of hope that it wasn't what it was. But being exhausted and on the run and scared and young, I just kind of, I just kind of let go. I walked in, and the officer stepped out, and I just kind of calmly said, okay.
So you say okay, and you get arrested, and you get processed, and you get brought to jail where you await the charges. And what is your understanding of sort of what you're facing? Like what do you think they're charging you with, and what's happening?
Well, at that time, I really wasn't sure exactly what was going on because I was under surveillance. Someone had turned me in, and I didn't understand. I was finding out piece by piece, but they were like pulling me out of my cell, telling me they were going to give me a cigarette, telling me it was the old school, tricks like let's get her to talk. And I was scared, and I wasn't only scared. I had become very close with my dealer. We were both two young-ish girls who were living in a world that most people couldn't understand, and we had bonded. So there were two things going on. One was I felt a loyalty, and the other is that I was scared, and I knew that I had stepped into a world that it wasn't so easy to get out of, and if you get out the wrong way, there could be consequences. So I just shut my mouth and didn't say anything, and they tried for days, and then eventually. one of the head women or one of the detectives came in. She was in plain clothes, and she tried to get me. She pulled out the papers and she was like, "You're facing 30 years. Like, we can help you, please." And she had bought me food because I hadn't eaten a lot. And I remember, like, looking back now, I remember like not understanding the consequences. I was so young that I didn't really understand what this all meant. And so I just let it happen and moved on to the next step. I remember getting transferred over to the prison. They put you in a shower before they send you through. It's like a whole processing thing. And then they give you your scrubs. And I still was, I think I just was in shock and disconnected from the reality of what was going on. And I think that's an issue with, I was 21 years old, and kids, it's like we're kids. There are kids that are being charged and sent to prison too young to understand consequence, and needing, instead of consequence, healing, needing to address addiction, needing to address the trauma underneath. And so I didn't get any of that, but looking back now as an adult that has done some healing and that has a lot of sobriety time, that's what I needed. And instead, I walked into a situation that I didn't know really how to handle and didn't understand the consequence.
Yeah, I mean, 30 years is serious time. And when you're looking at federal criminal charges, that's real. Like that's not just some kind of mythical thing that they were hanging over your head. That was very possible. But you, to your point, didn't want to cooperate. You didn't want to turn in the name of your drug dealer because you were afraid of the consequences that could come from being a quote unquote snitch. And you also just didn't know what was happening. But then someone showed up and said, "I'm your lawyer." Tell us about that.
Yeah, so I was totally not expecting that. I was in for a little bit of time. I hadn't called anyone. I was trying to figure out how to survive this, and I got a visitor. And in came a lawyer that my dealer had paid for. And she sat down and she was like, "I'm going to help you." I said, "Okay." And she tried to get off on a technicality and do anything she could do to kind of just get it squashed up front. We couldn't do that. And so she ended up, we ended up having an interesting relationship. I think in the end, she ended up really caring about me and doing everything she could to help me. Um, I found out um, about a year or two ago that she'd passed, and I was really sad because I wanted her to see this book. I talk about her, and I wanted to give her the credit um, that was due because obviously she was my lawyer, and obviously she was getting paid. But I do talk about a scene in there where I go in to see her after, and the compassion and kindness that she showed me was just beautiful and beyond. But yeah, I suddenly had a lawyer, and
And a good
I was very
lawyer.
grateful, and a good
Yeah.
lawyer. Yeah.
And a good lawyer. And so, she's trying to figure out a way to get these charges dismissed. That is not happening.
Yeah.
Um, but she does manage to work out, well, she does manage to get you out on bond. And I'm just wondering, you were young, white, tiny, and I came from a good background, a college student, even if you had kind of failed out. I'm wondering, what do you think your background, or how did your background impact the way that the court system treated you?
So, it's interesting. At first, what I found out, what she told me, was that there was a new law that first offenders could plead guilty, get a small prison sentence, and then a larger probation type parole thing, and basically not spend that much time in prison. And since I was a first offender, that she was going to try to get that deal for me, and she did. And I still managed to get a few years and some time, but then they had given me a chance. I ended up getting out on bail, and I got pregnant. And when I came back pregnant, my lawyer went to bat for me one more time and said, "Please, she says she wants to do this, and please give her a chance." And this was the point where I finally was going to do it. Like once I got pregnant, and I knew that I had this child growing inside of me, and that, I had a responsibility to someone else, not just myself. I really, really meant it. But I got a second chance. I got a chance that a lot of people who deserve just as much to get a second, even third chance don't, because of their race or possibly their economic background. And that's, just that's not fair. That's the reality. But that's not fair. And I think that highlights a big problem in our criminal justice system. You know, I
Hmm.
I I took that chance and did everything I could. And I ended up getting sober and and I made it. But there's so many other people that could take that chance and make it too. And they don't get that chance.
Yeah, I
So
mean, I love that you highlight that because it is true. You were given a tremendous benefit of a doubt under circumstances where, frankly, maybe you didn't quite deserve it. Given, I won't get into the details. You have to read the book. What happened when you were released on bond? But when you came back serious and sober and pregnant, they gave you the opportunity. Whereas, for folks who are familiar with the criminal legal system and what happens to women in prison, a lot of women who are pregnant are just kept in custody and forced to give birth while they're shackled to beds, and you didn't have that happen to you. You were given an opportunity and you were released. But before we go there, I did want to just go back to prison for just 1 second because you do come from a specific kind of background, a middle class background where probably nobody you knew had ever gone to prison. And I wonder, what about prison, your experience in prison, surprised you? Or what did you take away from that experience that you hadn't anticipated?
well, I think we talked earlier about people being multifaceted, and multiple things can exist at once. And so I was surrounded, just like myself as a criminal, by criminals, by people that had done things that they shouldn't have done. And yet I was also surrounded, these same people were very lovely, kind, thoughtful, people. And so I forged relationships in there, very real relationships. And there were also some issues, right? You're putting people in very small quarters, and we all have different traumas and different backgrounds, so there were also conflicts. But it was, it was all in all, it was an experience of being with people that shared trauma and backgrounds, and coming together and just trying to figure out, like, how we were going to survive this next thing. And the other thing is that I was on TV. So one of my first nights there, I was walking through, and the people watching TV were like, "Hey, that's you up on the screen," because
Wait, now
my
just to be,
arrest.
I was going to say, right, just to be clear, it's not like you were on TV like you were on, the Daily Show. You were on
Right,
TV
right. I
with
was
your prep walk. Like, they were like,
right.
look, there you are. You just got arrested and walked across the TV screen.
Yeah, right, exactly. And so, they were like, "Oh, you're a big dealer," and that does give you a little cred. So,
Wonderful.
after that, they wanted to hear stories, and we all talked about all of our stories. I talk about this one woman that talks about these heists, these jewels, and where she hid them, and how she got caught. I mean, it was wild. It was a wild experience of very human people coming together, trying to survive yet another life setback,
Yeah.
because most of us in there, as we know, come from life experiences that are pretty painful. And I think that's a whole other thing we have to look at in the criminal justice system, is how we punish and treat people that never had a shot from day one.
Yeah, and it's so interesting because women in prison raise a unique context that does differ from their male counterparts who are incarcerated. Women often bring with them experiences of sexual abuse, of violence, of being present for violence that maybe is a little bit different than their male counterparts. Did you find that in prison that most of the women that you were with had experienced or had some history with very severe trauma like that?
Yeah, so this is something that's really important to my heart, and something that I really look forward to working on, as I continue to talk about the book. And that is that I think as a society, we have to come together and take another look, a wider lens of why people, especially women, end up in prison. That there's a trauma history, there's reasons why, and why are we punishing everyone? Why can't we find a way to rehabilitate, to help, to heal, and heal our society as a whole?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, it is very exciting for folks who haven't yet bought the book. Proceeds from the book are going to go to an organization called Rise in Hawaii, and I'll be sure to provide the link in the show notes about that. That does, in fact, sort of focus on people who are unhoused and people with traumatic histories. Um, so, Nikki, you do wind up getting out. I won't spoil a lot of the details about that, too. You are pregnant. You come back to New Jersey. Just wondering, what was the hardest part about coming home?
I had to come back and face the demons that I had run from. Home is where it all started. And so here I was coming back, a different person that I left, a mother. I had lived a trauma my whole childhood and then lived this whole trauma in Hawaii that I now had to come to terms with and step back into the life that I had originally left. And that was not easy. That was a process, and it took me a lot of years to figure that out. It wasn't just, 1 or 2 years and I'm fine. It took me a long time of understanding and working through what had set me on that road in the first place.
And yet when you came home, when you made it home and you sort of did the work that you were doing, you not only just returned to suburbia, but you became a wife, a mom, you were gay in this community, you went on to have another child. Like, what was that like for you, knowing that you had this past that most people didn't know about?
Yeah, it was really interesting because there were times, and I talk about this in different places and at different, I've talked about this already, but there were times where I was literally at bake sales, or I had a field trip, or I was at a PTA meeting, and I had to leave and run and pee in a cup, because Hawaii let me go, but they owned me for years, and I had to make sure that I was clean, and I was clean. Every single test that I took was clean, but I was living this double life. And I wanted so badly to be this other person that I had grown into. I was the mom. I loved it. I was the trusted friend in community. I really was that person, but I was grappling with the person that I had been. Also, the person that I had been wasn't the true Nikki. It was the person like most of us that are out there, addicts, people that are incarcerated. We're traumatized. We are living a different version of ourselves that isn't our true nature. So when I removed the drugs, when I had started to live in suburbia and find myself, I found that I was a good person, and that I loved other people and I wanted to be trusted. I wanted to be a part of community. And so I enjoyed being this mom and this friend and this class parent so much. And most people didn't know. I had a friend or two here and there that knew. And eventually people that know now are like, how did you hide this from me for all these years? I've been living here for 25 years. But I really didn't think that was the way to start a party, just be like, hey, by the way.
Right, so
So
we're
I
going to sell
held
the
it.
right. We're going to sell the brownies,
Yeah.
3 for $1. And did I mention that I spent some time in a federal prison?
Yeah, exactly. Well, I could tell you about that story when I was on the run from the feds. you
Yeah,
know?
while
Um,
we're in the carpool line, did I ever tell you about that?
yeah.
Yeah. Um, you know, your book is titled, I think, somewhat brilliantly. It's titled Breaking Good. Obviously, it's an homage to the famous show of a slightly different name. Um, but it also says a lot. And I'm wondering, what does the good from Breaking Good mean to you now?
Yeah, I mean, we chose the title because obviously the the meth association, but that in the end I broke good. And, to me, I did everything I could to be the best person I could, to figure out where I came from, to do better with my children, to do the best I could, even though it wasn't at times good enough, to be a person in society that people respected, to be trusted, and to give back and, pay forward any way I could. And to me, that's what breaking good is. It's finding a way to be very human and real and honest and authentic. And I work hard every day at that. And it's a continual journey. It's not just a one off and done. It's a lifelong process.
Yeah, and it's about, sort of holding yourself accountable for what has happened in the past and trying to do better, which, as you said, you do every day. You know, I, as your friend, sort of saw you through the writing of this book, and I'm wondering, what was the hardest part for you about writing this book? Was it revisiting that old trauma? Was it more that you were worried about what other people would think? Was it more that you were worried you were going to hurt some people's feelings? Like, what was the hardest part of the writing process for you?
Well, I think so, all of it had its own, challenges. Of course, I was very careful in the book. I needed to put certain things in to move the story along and to explain where I came from, but I was very careful. I did not want to hurt anyone, and that was not my intention with the book. And the other part was that I promised myself if I was going to do this, I was going to be brutally honest. And it wasn't just about everyone else, it was about myself. And so that was hard too. That was hard because I was telling other people's stories and I was telling my stories, and I had to figure out a way to do it that I felt was fair to everyone. And writing the book was definitely a challenge. Revisiting those places and those things that I had done, that had been done to me and that I had done to other people, was a challenge. And cathartic. I think all writers will say it's very cathartic. But I think the most challenging part was once it went to print and I knew it was coming out and it became real, I had to grapple with everything. Everything
Mm-hmm.
that I had done, the vulnerability, the authenticity, what people would think, and how they would perceive me or other people that I put in the book. And I think it took me a bit of a process, but what I landed on was a radical acceptance of myself and a radical acceptance of the world. And in that, I was able to be free. And it
Yeah.
didn't only free me in that moment with the book, it freed me from a lifetime of pain and things that I held on to. And so now I walk through much lighter and freer because I told it. I told the story. I said it as honestly as I could, and I said it out loud, and I owned it.
Yeah, and you also said it with humor, and I don't mean humor like all the time, like funny, bright humor. I mean, some of it was quite dark. How did humor help you with your trauma? Help you deal with your trauma in the writing of this book? Fabulous, fabulous book.
Yeah, I think it's important. I think there are times where, of course, we have to be in the serious part of things and look at them and do the work. But I think it's also important to have humor and be funny. And there were certain times that I could look back and be like, okay, that is insane, but that is also absolutely hysterical. And
Yeah.
in those times, I tried to do that. And I wrote the book in a way where I wanted the reader to take my hand. I wanted them to be on the adventure with me. I wanted them to understand the highs and the lows and what everything felt like. And in doing that, I also felt like, being light in those moments and showing them that in the most pain, there are sometimes ways that we can laugh and feel and have some joy. And so that was the way I handled that, and that was the way I had decided to write it.
So, Nikki, if you could sit with your 18-year-old self or your 21-year-old self looking back, what would you tell her now?
I love that question because I love to think about that because I do tell myself that now. Um, I think I wish that I could have told her then that she was okay, that she was worthy of love, that she didn't do anything wrong. Those are the things that set me on the path to self destruction. I thought that I was bad. I thought I was wrong. I thought I was not lovable. And I think if I would have known those things, I would have had a very different life and experience. Not that I regret any of it, because it made me who I am today. And it taught me so much about myself and life. But that young girl needed to know that she did nothing wrong and that just for living and being, she deserved all the good.
Yeah. And just to be clear, when you say you did nothing wrong, or she, the 18, you're referring to, of course, what had happened to you in your home when you were a teenager, right?
I'm referring to all of the trauma that I experienced as a child from
Yeah.
very young until, it eventually stopped and I went off the rails and, ran to hide, to cover those negative feelings. Yeah, I know in Hawaii I did plenty wrong. I'm
Yeah.
talking to that 18-year-old girl was a product of that child. And
Right.
if I had known all those things inherently growing up, if I had felt like I was worthy, worthwhile, um, it would have been a very different experience.
Yeah. Yeah. That's right. That's right. Um, and then I guess, Nikki, this has been such a great conversation. I'm just wondering, to sort of reflect back overall on this arc, this is a show about second chances. It's a show about the criminal legal system. And I'm just wondering, what do you wish people knew or understood about the folks who wind up in prison? If you had any sort of advice or outlook that you'd like to share with the people that are listening.
Yeah, so I've thought about this a lot, and you know, I know that for myself, I didn't grow up thinking I wanted to be an addict. I wanted to end up in prison. I wanted to do things um, that could hurt other people, but yet I did. And I think that if you look at anyone else that is sitting in prison or that is homeless or on the streets or has done things that they wish they didn't do, they would say the same thing. You know, we as a society, I think, need to look at incarcerated people with much more compassion, empathy, and kindness, and understand why, why these things happened, what drove us to do these things, and how can we help? How can we make things better? And I think if we can do that, um, we're going in the right direction.
Well, Nikki, that's a beautiful place to end this conversation. I want to thank you so much for being on the show, for writing this incredible, really incredible memoir, Breaking Good. It really is a must read. I hope you'll all go out and read it. I'll put the link in the show notes. I'll put a link, again, to that wonderful organization that you are going to be supporting through some of the proceeds of this book. And thank you again for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed talking about my book and talking about, reform and what we can do to help people going forward. It's always a pleasure.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of Just Justice. If you like what you heard, please follow us wherever you listen to podcasts and tell a friend. To share an idea for the show or to stay in touch, head to jessicahenryjustice.com or find me on the socials at Jessica Henry Justice. See you next time.